All right, good morning, agents. This is Kevin Lauren. I'm the Director of Training and Marketing here at Alter Realty Group, and we are going to have a great training today. Lauren Noack will be joining us, and she's going to be going over the new RPA. And I really just want to say thank you to all the agents that are on the line today. We've got a packed webinar today, and so I'm really pleased with the turnout. And so this is one of those webinars that's, we don't like to say mandatory, but this is as close as it gets. Good morning, Bill. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Kevin. Good morning. Good
morning. So a lot of great, a lot of new agents on the line, a lot of our agents that have been here for a long time. Want to welcome a new team. We've got Ramon Acosta and his team that have just joined us, and really great to have you guys on the line as well. Dolores Pollard, Fatima Fauzi, Jack Buffa, new agent, Linda Tran, Marina Blackwell, a lot of really new agents. And so this is great. Really excited to get this webinar going today.
Yeah, I got a friend of mine, Ronnie Garcia, also on, Kevin, who's going to be joining, I believe, this week. So he's excited to learn about the new contract changes. And I agree. It's it is mandatory in the sense that you got to learn it. So we might as well take the time to do that.
Exactly. So this is great. This is going to be a one of 5-part series that Lauren's going to do for us. And, also, of course, we expect you guys to do the training with CAR, but this will help as well. If you haven't even looked at it, today's going to be a great, just brief overview. And so at least when you do the CAR training, you're going to have a lot of this background that Lauren's going to go through. So really good stuff. Before we get into today's presentation, I want to bring Cameron Alley from Clearview Mortgage on the line, and Cameron's going to bring us up to speed with what's going on in mortgage land today. All right, good morning, Cameron. How are you?
Good morning, everybody. How you doing, Kev?
Fantastic. The classic fall day today. It's a beautiful California day, I'm sure, up and down the state after the rain. So it's a great day for a webinar.
I agree. So I'll keep it nice and short today, guys, but lots of good news out of mortgage land. So first off, we'll start off by saying rates have kind of came down like we predicted a little bit. So pricing's looking a lot better, which is really great news. Last week, we kind of touched on the new conforming limits for your traditional counties of 625,000 up from around middle 500s. But they just released basically in the high cost counties, the new conforming limits are $937,500. So that's your LA County, your San Francisco area, your San Diego area, all those more expensive areas. They give you a lot more room on those conforming limits. So what that means is that you're gonna basically be able to get a lot better rates and a lot lower down payments than you normally would when you'd have to go jumbo in those counties. So if anyone has any questions on that, you can always reach out to me or Bill. And also if you're listing properties, make sure that you have a lender that can honor those loan limits, because it doesn't actually start till January 1st, but we're able to do it right now. So very big things there. And then also VA loans got a lot better, 94 basis points better today across the board. So that's great news. And another very important factor, we are now doing manufactured PUDs in condos through our best lender, UWM. So what that means is we can actually do manufactured homes or condos on leased land, which previously you couldn't really do with many lenders. So but as always, if you have any questions on that, feel free to reach out, and we'll let you get to your training.
All right, perfect.
Hey, Kev, real quick, let's show where everyone can find Cameron. Let's we pull up Cameron's information.
Here's Cameron.
There he is. There's a good-looking guy.
There he is. So direct phone number for Cameron, of course, is 619-313-7003, and you can always get him at Cameron@cvmloans.com. So easiest 2 ways to get a hold of Cameron.
Thanks for your time, guys.
Absolutely, buddy. And yeah, if you want to work with a true professional, there you go. Another of our true professionals that we work with is Lauren Noack. So Lauren, can you hop on the line with us? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hello, everybody.
All right. Good morning, Lauren. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm well. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure to have you on the line. Lauren brings a wealth of knowledge about contracts, and so she is our go-to person for this kind of stuff. And so pleasure to have you. Are you able to share your screen? Probably if I stop my screen share.
Yeah, yeah.
That'll help.
So let me pull up my stuff here too.
Awesome.
And
so of course, Lauren, a little background about Lauren for the new folks that are on the line. Lauren is she is the owner of TC Advantage, and she is our go-to transaction coordinator. So if you don't have a transaction coordinator, she is the one that you should use. And she, like I said, is the owner of the company, but she also does the compliance work for our company. So she is, if we really recommend that you use a TC first of all, and Lauren's group is the best. So we recommend her because it's so much easier for you guys to let them do what they're good at and you do what you're good at. And that saves time and streamlines your business. So there you go.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the plug.
Sure.
We agree with all of that. So today, I'm glad it's being recorded because, the new contract is a big deal, and it should not be taken lightly. It will be uncomfortable and it will be awkward for most agents in the beginning. But I honestly believe in the end, this new contract is going to be a huge improvement in how you guys do business and how contracts are written and negotiated. The new contract really aims to provide a lot more clarity in a more digestible format, and better language as well. So I've taken the 4-hour training class from CAR, which I recommend all agents should do, as well as the 8-hour forms trainer class on the new purchase agreement and all of the ancillary forms with that as well. So having gone through both of those, there's no way we're going to be able to cover everything today, but I'm hoping this is just going to give you a good general overview of what to expect, and if nothing else, motivate you to get further educated. So
Sure.
Without further ado.
Yeah, and of course, we're going to have Lauren come back for a 5-part series. So this is the
Exactly.
first of 5.
Exactly.
And so Lauren, take as long as you want. This stuff is so important. We're not going anywhere. So take as long as you want.
Okay, perfect. And I'll break a couple times throughout too for questions and as we kind of tackle each section here. But a little bit about me on who am I to be talking on this new contract. I've been in real estate since 2009. I've been owner operator of the TC Advantage since 2013. In that time, we've closed over 2,500 transactions. This year alone, we've closed about 450. We're on track for about 600 for the year. And so we've seen it all. And at our point as TCs, we typically get the contract once it's been fully executed or ratified. So this kind of training is really great to get to as many agents as possible, because we want you to be as informed as you can before the documents get to us, and then we have to go on kind of correction mode. I am a licensed agent. I don't sell real estate. I just have my license so that I can take trainings like this and keep up on all of my education. And I'm CAR certified as a transaction coordinator and also as a forms trainer. And there's my website. There is the TC Advantage. You can find out more about kind of our TC services from there. As I mentioned, it will be impossible to review everything this new contract has to offer. So today we're just going to touch on these few things. I'm going to go over some general housekeeping information. We'll talk about where you can find a copy of the new purchase agreement before it's released, when it's coming out, etc. The overall layout of the contract has completely changed. So we'll talk about the technical aspect of that layout. The most noticeable element is this new grid on the first 3 pages. So we're going to go over that and kind of how to read it and what that layout is. And then my goal is to sort of walk you through the basics of filling out the new contract and what you need to know about those terms within the grid when filling out the contract. So then we'll basically skip over the bulk of the text in the contract, which you should, of course, never do. You should read all the pages. But then we're going to focus on changes to the signature pages. And then I'll let you know kind of what our future webinars, the focus will be for those as well. So if you don't hear anything today that's sort of something you want to focus on, we might be touching base on it in the upcoming webinars. So first, where can you find a copy of the new purchase agreement? If you want to navigate to it now, you can, or in the future, you can find it by logging into car.org. Then up in the top, along the top bar, you'll click on Transaction Center. And then from there, you'll click on the standard forms link. And then you'll navigate to the hyperlink there that says Forms Revisions and New Form Releases. And this is where you'll find new contracts and new documents are revised or updated. They're released in June and December of every year. And this is where you can find that sort of summary page of not only what's coming up, but what's been released in the past as well, which is really helpful. You'll see a summary of that, and then they'll give you examples of the actual documents. So it's a good reference point. But from there, you'll click on the 2021 RPA draft. And this is going to be the most up-to-date version. There are going to be a few sort of grammatical tweaks that they're going to make, but for the most part, this is what the contract is going to look like. And then in the same spot where you'll find the link for the RPA draft, there's also links to take you directly to some of the CAR classes that they offer for the contract. That's the 4-hour course. And that 4-hour course actually counts towards your CE credits as well, which is nice. So
that's great to know.
Yeah, benefits all around. So a couple of other things about this new contract. The tentative release date for this is going to be the second week in December. I know that seems far away. It's not. Once we kind of get into like how involved this is, you're really going to want as much time as possible to learn how to navigate through it. And so any new contracts that are written after this contract is released must be on this new version. You don't have to go back and have new contracts written for open escrows or anything, but beware that you'll want to see this new version, which it'll be easy to recognize because it looks totally different. So it'll be an automatic update in ZipForm and Glide. But if you have a desktop version of ZipForms, or some agents I think have like a fillable PDF that maybe they go to every once in a while, that will not fly. So it'll need to be this new updated form. Also check any of the templates that you might have stored in ZipForm. It will not automatically update. So you'll need to check those and get those updated as well. On that note, there are going to be 2 types of purchase agreements that are going to be discontinued. That's going to be the manufactured home purchase agreement and the probate purchase agreement. The differences between those 2 contracts and just the regular purchase agreement were so minor that they've actually just put them on their own addendums, which we'll kind of touch on a little bit further. And then there are 7 additional purchase agreements that have been conformed along with the same format. Those are the residential income, commercial, vacant land, notice of default, new construction, and then 2 that I didn't even know existed, the already built subdivision and a condo conversion purchase agreement. So those are all getting tweaked and updated as well. But right now we're just going to talk about the general residential purchase agreement. And there's even been a few forms that have been sort of rebranded, you know, just to kind of add on to all of the confusion, and rebranded in a way that's really subtle. So, you know, just to keep you on your toes, make it a little more difficult, but we'll touch on those a little bit later.
Thanks, Car.
Yeah, right. So we're going to talk about the general layout here, and conceptually, everything's sort of been shuffled around and reformatted. And so because of that, if you have sort of your go-to phrases or clauses where it's, you know, it's always 14B is, you know, 10 days, or, you know, to reference inspection contingency, that's no longer the case. all of the reference points, all the location of all the terms, everything's been moved around and reshuffled. And it's to make the layout easier to understand and a little bit more simple. They've taken sections that were kind of longer and dense and broken them up into smaller sections. And so you'll kind of see as we go through what that looks like, but just keep that in mind. If you have any of those specific references you use all the time, those are all going to change. So this is a view of the first 2.5 pages. This is the grid. And what's important to know about the grid is all of the fillable fields, any negotiated terms have been moved to the grid on the first 3 pages, literally all of them. There is not another fillable field after page 4. So there's no longer searching through, 4 pages in for different contingency timeframes split up over the contract. There's also no more hiding or burying your terms in lines in the contract. Everything that you can fill out is in these first 4 pages. So having said that, this grid is not a summary. It is condensing all of those terms into one area. So don't skim over it. You should also always make sure to read the additional pages, which you'll hear me repeat a few times today. But that's probably the most important part to remember.
That's
On
interesting.
page 4,
That does make more sense, though.
it does. It
Even though
does.
it's a
And
change.
it's going to be a total change. But like I said, it's going to make things a little bit easier in the long run. So it's just going to take a minute for everybody to figure out how to navigate everything. So page 4, you'll see in that top section, that's the last time you'll see any kind of fillable field or checkbox or anything for the rest of the contract until you get towards the end here. So that section has all of the addendums and advisories and additional documents that need to be added to the contract. And then 1, 2, skip a few, we go all the way down to page 14. And this is where they have the liquidated damages and arbitration. And they've really made an effort for this section to stand out. They've drawn these little boxes around them. It's really obvious that they are separate clauses and separate parts of the contract. And so they've really tried to draw attention to those elements. And then page 15, you'll see has the buyer and the seller signatures. These are all on the same page, which is nice. We'll go over the big changes in more detail shortly, but at first glance, you can see, like I said, they're all on one page, which is nice. Currently, the buyer signature is on the bottom of one page and the seller's at the top of the next. And I can't tell you how many times people miss stuff on those pages. So, and then the last page of the contract is for the real estate agents, the broker section, the escrow confirmation. This page also has a new and very, very important section that we'll go over in more detail as well. But when I asked, the 4-hour CAR course and the 8-hour CAR course are both taught by the CAR attorneys, the CAR legal attorneys. And I asked each of them what they thought the biggest mistake would be made with this new contract, or the biggest oversight that they thought would happen. And their answer for both of them revolved around this page. So we'll get to that towards the end, but just keep that in mind. This is not just an arbitrary signature page. So as you've probably noticed, this purchase agreement is now 16 pages. So we've gone from 10 pages to 16. That does not include the buyer inspection advisory. That does not include any of the other ancillary documents bundled together with the contract, your wire fraud, your possible representation, just 16 pages of just the purchase agreement. Why? As I mentioned before, the goal of this new format is to make things easier. So there's sections of the contract that have been broken up into smaller pieces, spaced out. Moving all of the fields and reformatting that into that grid added an additional 2 pages. The signature pages now incorporate verbiage from 2 additional forms, so that bumped the size out a little bit as well. But the biggest mistake, one of the other biggest mistakes that will be made is not reading past page 4. Just because there's nowhere to fill in does not mean that there are not important terms that you and your clients should be aware of. So keep that in mind. Do we have any questions so far about any of this?
Lauren, is there initials at the bottom of each page, or is that gone?
There are initials at the bottom of each page.
Okay, so there's 14 basically pages with initials, arbitration, and then signature pages on 15 and 16.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So also the initial the sections for the initials are kind of scoot over to the side a little bit. So if you had templates set up in DocuSign to drag and drop any of the tabs, you're gonna have to scoot those over also because they've kind of moved over a little bit. So now we're gonna go over the grid, and this has combined all of the material terms are all right up front. Kind of a good rule of thumb is if it's not on the grid, it's not negotiable. Obviously, that's not strict, but it's kind of a good reference of like anything that you would want to adjust, change the default, add in your terms. It's all going to be in this grid. And the whole grid is located in section 3 of the purchase agreement. So,
and Lauren, I have a quick question from Charles Barnes.
Sure. Yeah.
Good morning, Charles. Hope you're doing well. Which page is most likely to have signature errors according to CAR attorneys? Page 15 or 16?
Oh, that was page 16. It's not necessarily errors. It's going to be sort of more along the lines of the oversight. And it's something that has to do with your delivery of documents. So people want to pay attention when they're filling it out, but we'll touch base on that a little more, but it's page 16.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
So this is a close-up of the grid, and it's broken up into 5 columns. The first column is the letter reference point within section 3. So the whole grid is section 3, and then each line and section here is that sort of subsection letter. So for example, the purchase price is going to be section 3A. This is important to know when you're doing your counter offers. Like I was talking about earlier, if you reference sections by their section number, this is where you're going to find that. The second column points to the specific paragraph or section in the body of the contract that has additional terms or clarification, more in-depth information and text about the specific item. And so in zip form, I believe they have a feature where if you click on that number, it will jump you directly to that section in the contract, which is nice. But they don't have anything kind of up and running for us to play around with. So in theory, that's should be really helpful. The third column is the actual term or the contractual element. This is what the rest of the column is going to be, or the rest of the line is going to be discussing. So there are not a lot of fields to fill in this column. This is mostly going to be boxes to select if the term applies or not. The fourth column is kind of the meat and bones. This is where you're going to put those offer terms. This is where you'll see the defaults, and then you'll be able to kind of modify from there. So get really comfortable with the text overflow addendum, or the TOA. And if you're not familiar with that, down below in this bottom section, you'll see how the TOA is reflected in the current purchase agreement. Basically, you just keep typing your terms into a line, and if your terms don't fit, then the TOA or text overflow addendum will be automatically generated to include all of that text. And it just keeps building and building and building. So then you'll see in the top section, this is the text overflow addendum, and you can have multiple reference points all on the same text overflow addendum. And so because these lines on this grid are so teeny tiny, you're going to see this a lot. So again, get kind of comfortable with it. Remember that the TOA form is not a standalone form. You can't search for it in zip forms. You can't pull it up manually. This is something that's automatically generated when your text exceeds the space amount on the contract. And then the fifth column, this is for the additional terms. This is where you get even more detailed with the term or the change or the element that is addressed in that specific line. So for example, here, the bottom line, we're looking at section 3H3, and this is talking about the term, the verification of loan application. And so this is part of the contract, and you have two options. In the fourth column, you can either have it attached to the offer, or it will be provided in, you can check a box and it'll be provided in 3 days, or you can fill out how many days it will take to provide this verification of a loan application. And then the fifth column, this is your kind of level up. Now you can specify what kind of loan application or verification is attached to the offer, or what kind will you provide in X amount of days. And you have your options for pre-qualification, pre-approval, or being fully underwritten pre-approval, which we'll touch base on this specific element a little bit later, but this is just an example of sort of leveling up that term and having all of that additional information. The other thing you can kind of see here is in the very bottom in that gray section, where it says section I is intentionally left blank. Section I and section O do not exist on the grid because they look like ones and zeros. And so if you were to counter something out, it could end up looking like numbers and not letters. So those don't exist. Are there any questions about kind of that layout in general before we sort of dive in page by page here?
Looks fairly self-explanatory. Almost, not really though.
Are people just huddling in a corner, kind of rocking slowly?
Definitely. This isn't happening. This isn't happening.
Yeah. So for page 1 on the purchase agreement, the first half has some subtle changes that you might not notice at first, but they're really important. And so we'll touch base on that and then get into that first half of the grid.
Okay, I do have a quick question from Albert Sufi. He's asking, sure, is this updated through Glide forms? Yes, it should be. So Glide and Zip forms are both licensed, have licenses for the CAR form. So they should both be getting them at the same time. And so it should be, as far as Glide's, what's it called? The wizard or whatever to fill out the contract. I don't know what their time frame is. Hopefully they're working on it now, but we'll see. But yes, it should be accessible. All these forms and updates and all that kind of stuff should all be accessible at the same time on Glide and on Zip form. Perfect. Thanks for that, Albert. Good question. Yeah. So the first thing that you'll notice here is that there is a much longer line for the APN number or the assessor parcel number. And currently there's barely enough room for one APN number, but now this is one long line that allows for multiple APNs to be listed. And so they did this because of the passage of SB 9, making it, there's a lot more eligibility to split your lots. And so they feel like this is probably going to become more common, is having multiple APNs. So now you can fill them all, add them all there. You also want to note that new verbiage was added right under that APN line that states postal and mailing address may be different from the city jurisdiction. Buyer is advised to investigate. This is really common in areas like Los Angeles or Orange County. For me personally, my mailing address is the city of West Hills, but it's actually the city of Los Angeles. So when I go to order something online and I fill out my mailing address, or it'll auto-populate as Los Angeles and not West Hills. So yeah, go ahead. Los Angeles is weird like that, huh? Yeah, it has a ton of them. There's a few in Orange County. That's kind of the ones that I'm more experienced with, but
that's why they've added this little term, is that sometimes, you know, you may think you're moving into one zip code or one city, and then, you know, you're like having to give people directions or your address, and it's actually, you know, somewhere different. It's also important for jurisdiction, you know, for voting, for, you know, like all kinds of stuff, how this would apply. So buyer is advised. The other item that was added is 2C, and it's this tiny little line crammed in there, but it's going to make a big difference if there's more than one brokerage representing a single party. So now you no longer need to cram both brokerage DRE numbers and names onto one line. This is right there available to just check the box that more than one brokerage represents either seller or buyer. And then it's going to incorporate that ABA form, which is the additional broker acknowledgement. And a side note on the ABA form, there is in paragraph 4 of that document, it notes that wherever the name of either broker is indicated in the agreement, the other broker shall also deem to be named. So you don't need to have both brokers, agents sign. You can utilize this form, and that will allow for sort of the interchangeable nature of the signatures for the brokers. Also, it's important to note this agency section, item B and C here, if it is not completed correctly, if the boxes checked are not correct or left blank, which I see all the time, or if the DRE numbers are missing or not correct, you would need to use the AC form, which is the confirmation of agency. So keep that in mind. It's important to verify this information. It's very easy to just let MLS or zip form autofill this section. You want to make sure that this is correct. And just an additional note, if the agent, they're two different agents, two different teams, but they're working for the same broker, that's a dual agent. So you want to check that box. So it's not agent represents seller and a different agent represents buyer. If both of those agents work for the same brokerage, they both work for Alta, it's a dual agency. So keep that in mind.
Got it.
And then you'll also see this again towards the end of the purchase agreement, but it cannot be stated enough. Read all 16 pages. There are 16 pages to this contract. Look them all over, read them all, know them all. This goes for you as the agent and for your clients. You may have noticed something missing from that first top half that is currently on the purchase agreement, but will not be in the new agreement, and that is the purchase price and the close of escrow date. Those are negotiable terms, so they have been moved down to the grid because all negotiable terms are now moved to the grid, and that includes purchase price and close of escrow date. You'll also see the box for all cash is right over there in the additional terms. It has to do with the purchase price. It's all together. It used to be buried in the middle of the financing information on page 1. Now it's a lot easier to determine right away. This is the purchase price and it's an all cash deal. Another thing to note about all cash offers is that the default in the purchase agreement, in this new purchase agreement, is that verification of funds is attached with the offer. And so keep that in mind, make sure the current contract, the default is that it will be provided within 3 days, and then you just check a box if it's included or not. And so now it's the other way around. And you'll see that a lot in this contract, things that are really subtle or minor like that throughout the contract and throughout the grid specifically have now been swapped because CAR noticed, oh, well, agents keep checking this box. We're just going to make the term in that box default. And now you just check a box if it's the other way. So you really are going to have to pay close attention to a lot of these elements.
Yeah, that's for sure. Good point.
So for the initial deposit section, there's now an option added where you can add in a percentage amount. And we've been told if you just type in the percentage, it should calculate the dollar amount and vice versa. But again, we'll see once they roll that out, or it might be a future feature. But the important thing to note here is that the percentage that you write in is just for reference. the percentage is not a contractual term. So what that means is that the deposit does not automatically adjust with the purchase price. So even if you say the deposit is $10,000, 3% of the purchase price, and then your purchase price goes up, the deposit is still 10% or 10,000. It does not then become 3%. So that's important to note. And they add that note in there. The percentage number is just for calculation purposes. So you can see really quickly at a glance, oh, this is only 1% of the purchase price, or oh my gosh, they're putting 20% down or whatever. The other important note, yeah, go ahead.
Quick question here. Albert asks, isn't the seller and broker agents uploaded automatically from the MLS?
Yeah, typically it'll pull that information automatically. Whoever's on MLS is the listing agent and the listing broker. It should auto-populate that information. And then obviously your information as the agent submitting the offer will auto-populate in there as well.
Awesome.
Okay, so the other important note about the deposit is the method of deposit. You'll see that the default is for wire transfer. And so currently, so it shows, you know, within 3 business days after acceptance by wire transfer. Currently it says electronic transfer, and the escrow companies that collaborated with CAR were like, this is dumb. Everybody does wire, just make it say wire, because then people get confused. So, and then there's a blank line if you need to write in that it's a cashier's check or a personal check or anything other than wire, you can still write that in. However, what's important to note is that the paragraph section referenced here with the initial deposit, this 5A1, that section has been added, and it states essentially that escrow has the final say in the delivery method of the deposit. So if you write in that the buyer is going to deliver their deposit by personal check, but the escrow company says, no, we don't accept that, we only take wire, then the delivery method automatically defaults to whatever the escrow company requires. There's no need for an addendum, no need for a correction. That's written into the contract. So keep that in mind as well, that the escrow company might bump it back and say, no, actually you need to send it as a wire.
That's good.
You'll also notice under the increased deposit, there's a mention of a form DID. This is one of those forms that was rebranded just to confuse everybody. I think it's used to be called the RID, or receipt for increased deposit. Agents really didn't even know that that existed to begin with, so I'm sure it's not going to traumatize too many people, but agents don't really receive any deposits anymore. So now they've renamed it the delivery of increased deposit. So they think they're helping. Anyway, that's what that form is. It's the same thing. Okay, so the next section for the loan amounts, on the far right column for additional terms, you'll see the default is conventional loan. It's actually that way in the current purchase agreement. I cannot tell you how many times I see agents check the other box and write in conventional. The default is conventional, so keep that in mind. You also have the option, you'll notice that if the FHA or a VA loan is selected, that there's the term the FVAC and the HID forms are incorporated. The HID is the one that says for your protection, get a home inspection. And so it's nice that they've made both of those linked up because they're both required anyway. So those documents will be required. You'll also see a little bit down in the third column under the loan amount, you'll see it says if FHA or VA is checked, then you must deliver a list of any lender required repairs, and you keep going over to the next column within 17 days after acceptance or however many days. So currently there is the FVA form, which is like the repair request for FHA and VA. Nobody ever uses it, so they're doing away with it. They have updated the repair request form with a little section. And so you can write in there, look, the lender's making us do this. The lender wants these items, you know, repaired. And so there's a section in the repair request form where you can specify that these are lender requested repairs. Oh, that's a tongue twister. Okay. So, and it gives them that time frame. You have 17 days after acceptance. If you're past those 17 days, if that's the default in the contract, and the lender, you know, has these repairs, the seller can reasonably deny or decline those repairs. Technically, the seller can decline any repairs at all, but they just have to know when it's an FHA or VA loan, if they are lender required repairs, then the buyer can't get their loan and they can cancel, and nobody wants that. So keep that in mind. Let's see. Okay. The other items to note in this section, the interest rate default is a fixed rate. That's the default, is that it's a fixed rate. Or you can check a box that it will be an adjustable rate, and then you need to specify what the not to exceed percentage amount should be. The points default, the next section down, is for the buyer to pay 0 points, or you can fill in any specific terms that apply. This is because there is no binding agreement without these terms, and on almost every contract I come across, the agents leave this section blank. So their solution for that is, look, we're going to make these default terms. It's a fixed rate and the buyer pays 0 points. However, you can have these terms, you know, fit to what actual circumstances are. It's just important that if you check the box for adjustable interest rate, that you fill in these sections. These are the loan terms that the loan contingency is based around. And so if they're blank, then you have ambiguity. Ambiguity potentially impacts the enforceability of the contract. So you want to make sure that this information is filled out and clear. It also lets the seller know the buyer is serious. We've done our research. Here's what we're coming in at. And it also gives the buyer protection, again, for cancellation rights of like, look, I said I was going to try and get it at this amount or at these rates, and I couldn't. Now I can cancel based on these loan terms. So this section is really important. Make sure that's completed and completed correctly. Another thing to note about the loan terms is that paragraph 5C3 now states that the buyer now gives the seller and the seller's authorized agent, that's you, permission to contact the buyer's lender and determine status of any buyer's loan. That is now written into the contract. So people are really excited about that. And it's also written in, if the buyer changes lenders, then the buyer is required to deliver updated contact information upon request within 1 day. And that's one of the examples of a term that is in the contract, but it's not negotiable. So there is no field here to say, okay, if we change our lender, we'll give you updated contact information within 2 days. No, you have 1 day. That's it. It's written into the contract.
Lauren, is that on subsequent pages? Is that part of the future?
Yes. So
content?
that is referenced in 5C3, and that's something that will also go into more detail on in additional webinars when we kind of go over the bulk of sort of financial stuff.
Yep, no problem.
And one quick question from Bon Huang.
Yeah.
He asks, is it required to use this new form for all transactions from now on? No, it's actually going to be the second week in December. Is that correct, Lauren?
Yes. So this is not available for use right now. It will be released for use in the second week of December is what they're tentatively trying to do. So sometimes that's a Monday, sometimes it's a different day of that week, but it's this contract. And again, all of this, there's 63 additional forms and documents referenced in this purchase agreement, and those all have to get updated.
Yeah, so Bon, we're just trying to get in front of all this stuff before it becomes a major disaster. So yeah, but good, great question. Thank you.
Yeah, which is why it's a good idea to go and navigate through CAR.org to get a copy of this so you can start looking it over and familiarizing yourself with it. Because when you get into, you know, zip forms or Glide and you haven't had a chance to get comfortable with this layout, it's going to be really overwhelming. So we're trying to, give you some time to prep for it. So again, the element of the buyer delivering updated contact information for a new lender within 1 day. Things like that, those are important loopholes to know as a listing agent if you're looking to get out of a contract, because even though that time frame is not negotiable, it's something that you can still deliver a notice to perform on. So keep that in mind. That's why it's important to read all of the additional pages. Okay, and the other item here is occupancy. Occupancy is currently buried at the very bottom of page 3 in the contract. And the only option right now is to check if the buyer does or does not intend to occupy the property. So this default now gives more options, and it gives more clarity to the lender because occupancy can affect the loan terms. So the default is that this is primary property, primary residence, or you can identify if it's a secondary residence or an investment property. Okay, any questions so far about the first page or anything additional? Cool, trucking along.
Popped up. Yeah.
Okay. I know, that was only page 1.
Wow.
So yeah. So try to speed through, but not too speedy.
Totally.
So the next section here, they have added a new area that was added because this is a term that was constantly being written in. So they just made it a section in the contract, and that's for seller credits. Seller credits to buyer. There's an option to use a percentage element, but again, like the deposit, this does not fluctuate based on sale price. It is just for reference only of, oh, this dollar amount is the equivalent of this percentage amount of the purchase price. You'll also see in the additional terms that the default is for credit to be applied to closing costs. There's no distinction between recurring and non-recurring closing costs. It's just for closing costs. And then paragraph 5E, which this term is associated with in the bulk of the contract. 5E referenced here says that the terms of credit are laid out in that if a total credit amount allowed by the lender is less than what the buyer was promised, then the credit is automatically reduced. So that's already written into the contract. That is why it's really important to double check and communicate with your lender. Hey, we're going to ask for this credit amount, or hey, this is what our total credit amount is. And then it also, that same paragraph also states that any credits have to be disclosed to the buyer's lender, and they have to be provided through escrow at closing. So again, they've really added elements and terms to create clarification and reduce any ambiguity. Okay, and then all of the verifications, all those verification requirements, those are all grouped together, and they're now attached to the offer by default. So the assumption is that they will be included with the offer. It's currently the other way around, which doesn't make any sense. The seller potentially has to enter into contract and then wait up to 3 days before knowing if a buyer is even qualified. So that's silly. The default is now 3 days. If it's anything different, you check the box. The seller should be aware of that and can decide accordingly. And now you can also specify the type of verification provided, which we kind of touched on a little bit earlier. You can either do pre-qualification, pre-approval, or have fully underwritten pre-approval, which essentially allows you to compete as an all-cash offer. If you're not sure of any of the differences between those, Bill can help you out.
Yeah, Lauren, are those the only 3 options?
Yes, they are.
So there's no DU approval?
Nope.
Interesting. Okay. Weird. And then we did touch on this last week about how to present a proper offer. Obviously you want it, if at all possible, present the proof of funds with your offer.
Yes.
If you're a listing agent, I don't see why you would take any offer seriously if you have to wait 3 days. That's just,
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes no sense.
Makes no sense. So always, unless there's some extenuating circumstance, present it with the proof of funds.
Yeah, exactly. And that also makes it part of the contract. So, compliance wise, this is why we ask for those items to be uploaded to the contract, or to the to SkySlope, or to, oh my gosh, mini seizure, to Dotloop. Because we need to see that they were presented, and that this has become a document attached to the contract. So keep that in mind, to hold on to those. And when you have your offer, your executed offer, TCs will also very much appreciate when you send the executed contract, please include proof of funds, everything that you got with the offer, pass it along, because we do need it.
Perfect.
Okay.
And then one other real quick question is there any reference about foreign buyers and their banking?
There is not.
Okay, I didn't think so.
No. Okay, this tiny little line, speaking of TCs, has TCs everywhere so excited, because this now puts a time frame on any assignment requests, and the most common assignments don't even require seller approval to begin with. So currently, we might find out a lot more often than usual at the 11th hour that a buyer wants to now purchase the property through an entity instead of as an individual, or maybe the buyer wants to add his wife to the purchase agreement. And they do this at the end, 3 days before closing or something like that. And it's always like, oh yeah, no, that's easy. Escrow just sends out this form. And contractually, that's not how that works. Contractually, you need to get seller approval, and the seller has to sign the AOAA form, and then the new person added or changed over has to sign all the documentation. And when you're 3 days from closing, that's all the disclosures, all the contract, all the repair requests, all the contingency rule. So really, this is the bane of all TC's existence. It's a huge pain. So now buyers have 17 days to request any sort of assignment if they want to make that change, to add any kind of buyer or make any assignment. If their request comes after the 17 days, or whatever the time is that gets filled out there, the seller can reasonably decline and say, no, you have to purchase, you can put it in your LLC after we close, or you can add your wife after. But at this point, there's this limit. So for the sake of TCs everywhere, agents, please know this is going to exist, and please enforce it. There are a couple of important caveats to this. And so now there's that time frame. But if they want to, say the buyer wants to make a purchase under his LLC instead of himself as an individual, if he is the only member of that LLC, or if a husband and wife purchases individuals and they want to put it in their trust, and they are the only trustees of their trust and it's a living trust, they don't need seller's approval. They can just make that change. And it's already written in the contract in paragraph 23 that they can do that, as long as the individuals are the same as the signers for the entity, which is awesome. The only condition is that the entity has to be in existence at the time of this assignment. So you can't like change it over and then be like, okay, but I'm still forming this LLC or something like that. It has to be in existence already.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, exactly. So, because God help me, I have had a few transactions where, oh, we're gonna put it into our LLC we're forming for this property because we're gonna flip it, and then okay, everybody
Right.
sign, get all the members. Oh no, we're not. And then it's like, oh my God.
Oh, don't worry, I'll just redo all the paperwork. Thanks.
Oh, yeah, exactly. So this is why we're super excited. And then finally, the paragraph 23 also states that whether or not seller's consent is needed, the buyer still needs to deliver a letter from the assignee's lender, assuming there is one, that it's not all cash, that the assignee is pre-qualified or pre-approved as specified. So if they're adding their wife, then you're going to need a new pre-qualification or pre-approval that the wife is also qualified based on the terms written into the contract. If you're just changing it over into your entity, you still need something from the lender saying, yeah, the entity is still qualified, they can purchase under this loan or whatever the case is. So whether or not the seller has to sign off on it and approve, you still need this added element. That's another one of those loopholes to keep in mind if you're looking to get out of a contract as a listing agent. These are things that you can hold the buyer responsible for. Okay. This contingency section, first thing to notice, biggest change, all the default timeframes are now 17 days. There's no more 21 days for loan, 17 days. Most lenders have a hard time sticking with 21, so who cares? Everything's 17 across the board. You can obviously fill in the blank, change it, but everything is 17. They try to make it super uniform. There are 2 contingencies that can be removed in the contract without attaching a CR form, contingency removal form. You can just check these boxes for no loan contingency or no appraisal contingency, and that's it. You don't have to fill out the CR form. All of the remaining contingencies here do require the CR form to be attached if you're removing them with the offer. And you can see in the box on the far right under removal or waiver of contingency, there's that little box that says CR attached. So that's where you would clarify which specific contingencies are being removed if they are not loan or appraisal. The important thing here to note that you can see is there are actually more than just 3 contingencies. It is a common misconception that there is just inspection, loan, and appraisal contingencies. There are a lot. And so the other thing that you'll see here that's highlighted is that in between all of these contingencies is a section that is actually not about contingencies. And this is the buyer's right to access the property. And so this could be for taking measurements, consulting with contractors, giving mom and dad a tour, whatever. This can be a different time frame from the other contingencies. Maybe you say, okay, you have 7 days to remove your investigation of property and get all of your inspections done, but you can have 17 days to have access to the property if you need to bring somebody by to take measurements or something like that. So those can be 2 separate timeframes. And that's important to keep in mind. Just because you remove your investigation contingency might not necessarily mean you can never go back to the property until closing or the final walkthrough. New language has also been added in the contract around the prelim, and those paragraphs are referenced on that prelim contingency. So that's paragraph 8E and 13A. But basically now the buyer has 5 days after receipt of a revised prelim to cancel if the revised prelim reveals any sort of material or substantial deviations from a previously provided prelim. So getting a revised prelim reopens the possibility for cancellation rights. And then we'll get more into the contingencies and timeframes and those specifics and logistics on a different webinar. This is the updated contingency removal form, just the little section where you can check all of those contingencies, but you can see that there are a ton of individual contingencies. You can get really specific on what is being removed. You can remove, the investigation or the inspection contingency doesn't include property disclosures or seller's documents. That's separate. That's another common misconception, is that they're all mushed together. You can remove the inspection contingency and not the disclosure contingency. And then you can get even more specific, where you remove the review of seller documents, except maybe you don't have a 9A report for a city of Los Angeles. Maybe you're waiting on a retrofit inspection, or maybe you haven't received some of the statutory disclosures, but you have everything else. So you can get really specific. There are a lot of different smaller contingency removals to keep in mind about here. It's important to note there's more than just 3. Okay, moving on to possession. Another thing to note, the time of possession is now upon notice of recordation by default. Currently in the contract, it's close of escrow at 6 p.m., but now it's as soon as you have notice of recording, now you have possession. I think for a while, people might write in their, check the box of 6 p.m. or, anything like that, make those additional time adjustments. But keep that in mind that right now the default is that it's notice of recordation. Another item to note about occupancy is that there is new language written into paragraph 7 about the condition of the property and all the debris and personal property. If there is any debris or personal property left over when the buyer takes possession, that is not it. Well, let me back up. The paragraph 7B clarifies that any debris and personal property not included in the purchase agreement shall be removed by close of escrow. And then there's also language that talks about how to address items that are left behind. So if there are items that are not removed when possession is delivered to the buyer, all those items shall be deemed abandoned. So unless this is negotiated, that, oh, the seller will come and pick these up later or anything like that, they're deemed abandoned. So, hey, great, maybe I came into some furniture, I didn't ask for it, but they left it, it's mine now. What if you don't want their crap? So in that case, the buyer has to deliver to seller a notice to remove items within 3 days. Doesn't have to be anything formal. They're actually working on creating a sample letter in the CAR forms library, but essentially they have to notify the seller, come get your stuff. And if the sellers don't, or they don't get any response and the buyer then has to pay for removal of these items, the buyer does have options to then bring legal action to receive reasonable costs reimbursed from the seller. So that is something, again, that is kind of further into the contract, but it's really important to know, get your stuff out of the property or you can end up having to pay for them to haul it away.
Right? What a pet peeve.
Yeah.
That sounds like a fun enforcement.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good luck.
No kidding. Yeah. So, and then you get into the whole element of, well, how does the buyer notify the seller? Do they do that through the agent? Well, the agency relationship is terminated at close of escrow. So now is the agent responsible for passing this message along, even though they're not technically the agent, and all that fun stuff. So take the course, they go into that in much more detail, but something to keep in mind. Excuse me. Okay. The biggest change here, so you have your time of possession is default upon recording. You can also select in the section underneath that if the seller is going to stay, if it'll be seller occupied. Again, if it's 29 days or less, you use the SIP form, 30 days or more, you use the residential lease after sale. The biggest change here has to do with tenant occupied units. There's a whole new document and procedure for properties that are tenant occupied. Currently, you have the tenant in possession form, the TIP, that is going away. There will be a new form called the TOPA, the TOPA, that is the tenant occupied property addendum. So this form needs to be used whether the tenant is staying or not. So if the time the offer is written or the time of acceptance, if there is a tenant, but it's going to be delivered vacant, you still need to use this form. And on this form, the default is that the tenant is to remain in possession. And then the bottom chunk of the form is all of those terms for when the tenant remains in possession. But if the property is going to be delivered vacant, you have to check the box stating that the property will be delivered vacant, or if there's a specific unit number out of a multi-unit, you would specify on this form. And then there are some limited buyer remedies if the seller is unable to deliver the property vacant. So if they incur any expenses, the buyer can cancel if they can't get the tenant out or vacate the property. So these are important things to know when purchasing a tenant occupied property, especially when dealing with rent moratoriums and evictions and all that kind of fun stuff. So this form is required whether or not the tenant is remaining in the property. Okay. The elements for the documents, fees, and compliance are the same, except for this brand new section, which has been added. And this is this gives the seller by default 7 days after acceptance to install smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, and water heater strapping. This is a requirement, a performance deadline for the seller. The important terms for this requirement are referenced in paragraph 10B, section 1. And this outlines that there are actual financial consequences to the seller for failure to meet this duty. So basically, an example would be if the seller doesn't install the smoke detectors or carbon monoxide or water heater strapping, the buyer pays for an appraisal to go out, and the appraiser has to then come back out and do a reinspection because those items aren't taken care of. The seller, in the paragraph, in the contract, it's already written, the seller is responsible for that cost of the reinspection. If that then causes a delay in the loan, maybe they need to extend their rate lock, maybe there's a fee associated with that because it's not done in a timely manner because this stuff wasn't done, the seller will be responsible for that. So it's really important that the seller is aware, if it's not done already, make sure it's done within 7 days. And keep in mind, sometimes appraisers will get out there before the 7 days. So keep that in mind.
Well, to that point, Lauren, we're doing a lot of appraisals on rushes right now.
Mm-hmm.
So the appraiser is coming out within 7 days.
Right. So as the buyer's agent, talk with your lender on what kind of those realistic timeframes would be, and maybe write in, 3 days or 5 days or what have you. And as the listing agent, look in this section, make sure that the seller now doesn't have a shortened time frame to get this stuff done. And so this is going to be an important element and a section to check because it could have some major costs associated with failure to perform.
Yeah, Bill, Raj says, good thing we have UWM and Clearview Mortgage.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's right.
Good point, Raj. Thank you.
So that was page 2. We're almost through. Does anybody have any questions about page 2?
I don't see any on the chat.
Cool. Cruise through here. So this section at the top of page 3 talks about items included and excluded. This section is really important to read, review, and also become really familiar with the paragraph that it's associated with further on in the contract. So this section has been kind of condensed. It's pulled some of these different terms from all over the contract and put them into one section. And then they've added some items. So you'll see this is now where you check if a stove is included, refrigerators included. They've added things like a wine fridge, video doorbells, electric car charging systems, potted trees and shrubs. So these are just things that you can add on, right? It kind of looks like page 1 of the TDS, the transfer disclosure statement, where you're just kind of checking off what the property has. But these are all things that the buyer is asking to be included that aren't included by default. So please note, wall-mounted brackets are now excluded from the contract unless this box is checked here. In the current purchase agreement, it's the other way around. The current purchase agreement is that the brackets stay and you have to check if you want them removed and the holes patched or something. So note that you now have to check if you want the brackets left. It's important to read this section 9B with your buyer and know what is included by default for a couple of reasons. One, know what's included by default so you know if there's any of those items that you don't want. But there are things in here that they've added and expanded and gotten more detailed on. Things like ceiling fans, light bulbs, including smart light bulbs, window coverings, where they go on to be specific about blinds, curtains, drapery, shutters. But there isn't things like curtain rods. So like how specific do you need to get with certain elements on the property of what is and is not included? Things like pool and spa equipment, they now list pool nets, motorized cleaners, pool covers. If you have like the little pool robot or something like that, that's default included in the purchase. So another good rule of thumb is that if you have to damage the property to remove it, then it's probably a fixture. But If there are things listed here in 9B that are included by default that the buyer doesn't want, then you're going to put those items in section P2 below all of these checkboxes on items that are excluded. And remember, the text overflow addendum is going to auto-populate. So don't feel limited by these 3 tiny little lines. If there's a bunch of stuff that you don't want included, be really specific. This is the place to do it. Don't rely on MLS. Don't rely on assumptions. Put it all in here. Listing agents, be aware of what's checked in this section and what might need to be countered out. Know what is in default in the purchase agreement so that you can then have a counteroffer that says, we're taking our smart light bulbs with us, because otherwise it will be assumed that all of these things are included. There are other references made to non-dedicated devices, which would be, for example, if you use your cell phone to control your thermostat or you have an app for something specific, then your cell phone doesn't get included with the sale of the property, right? That's a non-dedicated device. However, if you have an Alexa or a Google Home that you use to close the blinds and change the thermostat and has additional automations, then that Alexa might be included in the contract. It's really not clearly defined. So make sure that you have specified those terms, whether you're the seller and you want to take it with you, or the buyer, you're the buyer and you want to keep it.
It's so interesting as technology changes, you know, we need to account for all this new stuff, huh?
Exactly.
Interesting.
So don't make any assumptions. Be as specific as possible is the best advice in that area. If you don't see it specifically called out, then call it out. Okay, so this section is all about the allocation of costs, and this determines who pays for specific items. There's a box that you can check for both. If that box is checked, then the cost is split equally, 50-50. You'll see any mention of termite or wood destroying pest inspections, still not a part of the contract. I know people were like, bring that back. No, CAR believes it's really bad advice to accept responsibility for payment of repairs when you don't know what that amount is going to be. So writing into termite clearance, seller to provide section 1 termite clearance, they don't recommend that the seller accepts that term because they don't know what that cost is going to be. Unless you're more up north and you already have your termite report or things like that, that's different. But if in general, they don't believe that it's a good idea. So if you want to include termite clearance, that should be written in on the request for repairs and not in the contract. The section for government reports is broken up into 2 sections: who pays for the inspection or the report, and then who pays for the work called out in that report. So those are broken up. This is for things like retrofit inspections and that sort of a thing. You'll also see for an option for escrow fees that there is now a box that you can check to each pay their own fees. Everybody is so sick and tired of writing that in, they made it a box. You'll also see the section right above those 2 red arrows for smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, and water heater bracing. So this is mentioned again. The first time when we just saw it, it was associated with the time frame and responsibility for doing that. Now we're talking about the cost of doing those requirements. So if, for example, the buyer says, okay, I'm going to pay the cost for smoke alarms, CO2 detectors, and water heater straps, here are the smoke detectors, and the seller doesn't install them within the 7 days or whatever that deadline is as determined, then the seller is going to be responsible for the costs associated with it. So saying the buyer is responsible for that cost is not a get out of jail free card for the seller on the obligation to make sure those items are taken care of. Okay, and then these final items, the last section of the allocation of costs. These final items on the grid, you should note that the seller is responsible for all the HOA fee associated with preparing all the HOA disclosures. That's non-negotiable, it's just filled in there. Currently, it's that way only for the mandatory documents. And they were like, this is the escrow companies they consulted with were like, this is such a pain to split all this up. The seller's responsible for preparing any documents. As for the HOA transfer fees, there's now new language added into the contract that states the sellers to pay the move-out fees and the buyers to pay for any separate move-in fees. This only applies if the fees are billed or itemized with the specific costs within the transfer fee. So if those are provided, then it's already deemed that each will kind of pay their own in that sense. And finally, the biggest change has to do with the home warranty. So the new layout of this section allows for the buyer to specify any type of plan or coverage, or even just say like buyer's choice, and then to say the cost not to exceed over in that far right column. Currently, the way that it's worded in the contract, it's where the cost is not to exceed X amount of dollars for this specific coverage. And that ends up causing kind of limitation to what can be included in the warranty, or it causes overages in the home warranty amount. So this is going to be a lot easier. It's going to avoid a lot of that issue. There's also reference you'll see in paragraph section 10C that clarifies that the seller is not obligated to pay for any more than their share. So if the cost is written in, seller pays for this home warranty plan not to exceed $500. If the cost of the plan that the buyer selects exceeds this dollar amount, then the buyer is contractually obligated to pay the difference, automatically written into the contract. We don't need to have any back and forth. Who's going to pay? Who's going to credit? Whatever. Just nope, buyer pays for the overage. So it's important. Buyer's agents and even listing agents, I've seen them counter back out where they like cut the home warranty fee in half or whatever the case is. Know your home warranty costs and what the coverage is and what those dollar amounts are going to be. You will see two terms in that were not on the grid that were previously available to kind of write in or modify and negotiate. And those are the notice to perform and the demand to close. These terms are no longer negotiable, so they are not on the grid. You can't fill them out. They are in the contract where the notice to perform can be delivered up to 2 days prior to the scheduled performance day. That's it. You can't make it shorter, longer, 2 days. And then for the demand to close, this gives the party at least 3 days after delivery to close escrow. You can't shorten that time frame or change that time frame. That's what it is in the contract. Okay, trucking along. Before I move on, are there any questions about page 3 or about the grid in general?
I don't see any in the chat.
Cool. Okay. Now this part, this is where we make the contract even longer. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, that's all right.
Okay. So this is where we're going to make the contract even longer by adding additional addendums and advisories. So the probate and the manufactured home purchase agreements will, these purchase addendums are now going to take the place of the individual purchase agreements. So those will no longer be available. You'll just check these boxes or what applies if that is the type of sale. You may even check both of them, whatever applies. It's not one or the other. And then the TOPA, the TOPA form for the tenant occupied properties, we've already discussed. This would get checked. These last two are actually two new forms that will also be released with the contract. So the first is the TIC, or Tenancy in Common, PA, which is purchase addendum, and then the COOP, which is the stock cooperative purchase addendum. And so these are two types of properties that are becoming more and more common. And so CAR created these purchase addendums and also separate ownership advisories, which this is where it gets fun for the TCs. So there is the, for example, you have your TIC-PA, which is the Tenancy in Common purchase addendum. Then you also have the TIC-OA, which is a separate advisory, ownership advisory. So good luck not mixing those up. They also have a financial disclosure for the tenancy in common as well. So with the tenancy in common purchase, it's important to note there should be a separate agreement in place. This purchase addendum is not the agreement. there should be something separate as well. And then the stock cooperative purchase addendum includes default timeframes for submitting documentation to board approval, notifies the buyer of like, you need board approval and what that process is going to be like. There's also going to be a new purchase addendum that's not listed here that will be coming out soon, maybe a little bit after they release, but it's the completed new construction addendum. So currently there's a new construction addendum. This is for if the property is new construction and it's been completed. So they had a whole separate form, and that'll cover insulation, warranties, that sort of a thing. Okay. Any other addendum, you have your basic line if you want to attach a specific addendum. There, you don't need to check this box if you have text overflow addendums. Those are separate, those are different. Keep that in mind. These are your common addendums. But the thing to note is the SWPI, which is short for the rolls off your tongue form, septic inspection, well inspection, property monument, and propane tank allocation of cost addendum. Say that 10 times fast.
Wow.
This form convinced me that the CAR committee just gets a bonus for word count, where they're just like, what other words can we add to this?
For sure.
So,
And they're over there snickering about it too as we speak.
so obnoxious. So
real quick here.
Yeah.
Charles Barnes is asking, what about HOA documents outside or in addition to those provided by HomeWise?
As far as the allocation of costs goes,
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. Yeah, go ahead.
so HomeWise should provide your statutory HOA documents. That section that talks about the HOA document requirements is for the costs associated with it, which would just be the sellers responsible for all of those. If there is an additional cost to order more documents, then that would be the seller's responsibility.
Okay.
Okay, so the septic SWPI. Anyway, this is a really flexible form, so you have to read it carefully and you have to fill it out carefully. Agents should know what applies to the specific areas and what's required. So for example, if there is a cert that's required, and then in order to get the cert, you have to have repairs done, and then the repairs are an additional cost, then the parties need to agree who pays for the cert, who pays for the inspection to get the cert, who pays for the costs associated with the repairs to get the cert. So you can see there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of kind of gray area that needs to be confirmed on this form. The form, again, doesn't just apply to septic inspections. We're talking about wells, property monuments, and propane tanks. If there is no agreement, this could be cause for cancellation. So this is a point of negotiation. If it gets submitted and the seller says, I'm not going to pay for that stuff, and the buyer is like, well, I'm not going to pay for it, then you don't have a deal. You can cancel. So if those sections aren't filled out, again, that creates ambiguity. Nobody understands. You can have an issue. The other form is the court confirmation addendum. And this is one that most people aren't aware of, already exists. Most agents typically think of probate when talking about court confirmation, but it's important to remember this can also apply to bankruptcy. It can apply to family court if you're going through a divorce. So there can be other instances aside from probate where court confirmation is required, and you can check that document. And then these other two in red, the BXA and the SXA, these are other versions of stupid rebranding for forms that already exist. These are just renamed versions of the forms that are used for a 1031 exchange. So most agents didn't use these to begin with, but now they just have different code names. They used to be called supplements, but they're not really a supplement. So now they're just addendums, and that's their code. So it's the same thing. And then as far as the advisories go, the wildfire disaster advisory, this was added as an option to check. It's an optional document, but it's usually a good idea to include if a property is near, definitely in any kind of wildfire area. So you can check that box to include it as well. Okay, and then there are a few key terms and changes to be aware of that kind of fall in between the grid and the signature pages. And those are paragraph 11. The tax withholding disclosure is a statutory requirement. The FERPTA, it's the CAR Form AS. I still get a lot of agents tell me, oh, you'll get the FERPTA form from escrow with the closing package. But it's actually a statutory disclosure requirement, and it should be delivered with the disclosures. So there's new verbiage and an expanded section that gives a better explanation on how to comply with this requirement, what constitutes as being compliant, right? Because it's been such an issue in the past because just don't want to just pass around forms with their social security numbers on it. So this really kind of goes into explaining that process and what needs to be done and how to do it. You just need to know that the default in the contract is for escrow, is to instruct escrow to withhold any kind of required amount of funds and forward them to the IRS and the tax board. So if the seller has to supply certain information in order to claim an exemption from that withholding. And so that's where that document comes in, and that's where that information needs to be provided upfront with the disclosures. Another form that got a dumb rebrand is the lead-based paint disclosure. Currently, the lead-based paint disclosure had the code FLD, which technically was like federal lead paint disclosure or something, but people kept confusing it, thought it was like a flood disclosure, and it was confusing. So now they've changed the code. It's no longer FLD, but LPD. So have fun with that. And then again, paragraph 12, this just has new language added stating that the seller has to make the property available for inspections, but they don't have to move their stuff around. They don't need to accommodate and like clear things out for these inspections. And then they are required to keep utilities on until possession. It just kind of re-clarifies this information. Section 20 or paragraph 21 is a new section regarding photos on the MLS. This is that the buyer acknowledges there are images of the property that are on the MLS, will stay there until escrow closes. That's an MLS requirement. And also that they are now on the internet. And when you put things on the internet, you can't always get them off the internet. And this is the phrase for the same people that make us have advisories to not bring our hairdryer in the bathtub and like don't lick our curling iron. Like this is kind of for those people. They had to write it down.
It's good. It's a good thing, right?
I guess so. Because you know, let's just make it longer. Why not?
Right. And quick question.
Questions?
Yeah, quick question from Cheryl Peterson. She's asking if you can only, is it okay to only list the last 4 of the client's social?
So actually the form, the default of that CAR Form AS, the FERPTA form, the default does not require a social security number. The default is that the seller is signing this affidavit saying, I'm providing the information required to qualify for this exemption to a qualified substitute. And that qualified substitute is escrow. So the seller will give their social security number and information to escrow. Escrow will then sign the CAR Form QS, or sometimes they have their own equivalent form saying, we are in receipt of this information from the seller. Cool. So they don't, it's kind of like a little workaround where they don't have to provide that information to the buyer directly on that form.
Okay, does that answer your question, Cheryl? You can just type in there if you want.
Okay, so we're almost there. The second to last page, and then the last page, we're talking about signatures. The buyer and the seller signature section, these are the final 2 paragraphs in the contract, and they contain information. It's more than just signatures. Okay, So first, you'll remember in the current contract, typically this is where you would find information about the expiration of offer. You would fill in the date and time and who you have to deliver it, the response to or whatever. That's a fillable field. So where does it go? On the grid. So that is like the third item on the grid, is this expiration of offer term. This just points you back to that section. The next section is specifically for entity buyers. And this is an awesome addition. This will take the place of a separate RCSD form. And you can see if this paragraph is completed, the RCSD is not required. So this applies if the buyer, and it's similar for, it's the exact same thing for the seller, but if the buyer is a trust, whether that's a revocable trust, living trust, irrevocable trust, doesn't matter, an LLC, a corporation, an estate, they're all listed here. If something listed is not listed here, you can check the box and say other, and fill in the blank there. But this is a generalization. You don't even have to check a box of which one it is. You just, if they are this entity. Then you want to remember, if the buyer is an entity, all the way back on page 1, where you're writing in at the very top the name of the buyer, it should be that entity, right? So for example, if the TC Advantage is purchasing this property, the buyer is the TC Advantage. And now I am the authorized signer for the TC Advantage. So in section 32B2, excuse me, you'll see you write in who are the authorized signers for the TC Advantage. And I wrote in my name and my husband's name. So now down in the signature section, you sign your name, the printed name of the buyer, which is still the TC Advantage. And then you're going to check this box that you're the authorized signer and type your name and then whatever the title is. So this is the way to incorporate that representative capacity just right there in the contract, and it makes things super simple. You can, the RCSD forms are still going to be available. They can still come into play. Obviously, maybe if you're going to assign, go from individuals to a trust or something like that, you will need that form outside of this purchase agreement. So it's still available, but you don't need it if you fill it out at the time of the offer. Also, there's another mention. This is a 16-page contract. You should read every page. It's so important. They put it in there a bunch of times. And then this is the seller section. At this point, the seller has the option, right? So the buyer will sign up there, submit it. The seller has the option. They can either sign below and accept the offer, or they can check a box to incorporate either a seller counteroffer or seller multiple counteroffer, or they can check a box that there's a backup offer addendum, or you can check both of them. They both may apply. You'll note there's no longer a section to like fill out the date for the counteroffers or any of those things. They just, one less thing. Nobody filled it out anyway. It was always overlooked, so they just took it off. You'll also see there's no longer a section for confirmation of receipt. So the seller accepts this offer. There's nowhere for the buyer's agent or the buyer to initial confirmation of receipt. It was never a legal requirement in the first place, and nobody ever did it correctly anyway. So they just took it off, which I fully support. And then you have the same elements for an entity signer apply in this section as well for the seller. Also, note to seller, this contract is 16 pages. You should read all of the pages because they are important.
Again.
One more time. So this is an excerpt from the seller counteroffer and the seller multiple counteroffer that will be updated. You'll see on both the seller counter and the seller multiple counter, they now have an expanded section where you can specifically select and incorporate some of the more common forms. Currently, I think it's like a tiny line and one of them says addendum and the others are blank and whatever. So now you can just kind of check these and it'll auto attach these documents when you check the box, which is nice. I would also like to take just a quick second to note the very first two terms in the counteroffer, which I feel like are the two most overlooked sections on the counteroffer. The first is stating that liquidated damages and arbitration clauses if they are not initialed by all parties, then they're excluded from the agreement. Why this is important is because most of the time, the buyer's agent is going to receive the counteroffer for the buyer to sign and accept, but not the rest of the offer. So you might then sign this counteroffer opening escrow, and then, oh yeah, here's the fully executed contract. Oh, my client didn't sign the arbitration. So you don't know until after the fact if the seller even agrees to it or not. So buyer's agents, you should ask for the full contract back, not just the counteroffer. And seller's agents, listing agents, you should have them sign the full contract.
That's a very good point, Lauren.
Yeah.
That's a possible pitfall zone right there.
It really is. And I see it all the time. And, sometimes they'll write in, you'll see on a counteroffer where the listing agent will say, buyer to initial this section or something like that. But there's still no confirmation that those terms are incorporated unless you get them back and see that they've been initialed. So before you accept this counteroffer, make sure that those terms are agreed to. And then the second item B, clarifies that the initial and the increased deposit amounts do not change based on the purchase price. The down payment and the loan amounts will fluctuate and adjust based on the purchase price, but not the deposit. I see all the time, a lot of escrow companies will take the initiative of being like, oh, we had a wire request for this additional amount because the price is higher. And it's like, no, it's right. It's written right here. It's not going to change unless you specify deposit to be higher, a certain amount, anything like that. Unless it's that, then it should be whatever's written into the contract as a deposit. So these are really important terms in the counteroffer that get overlooked all the time. Okay, the last page is for the real estate broker section. This is where the buyer's broker and the seller's broker sections are exactly the same. So I just put for the buyer section so it would fit on my slide. Remember on page 1, there was a box to check if there was more than one broker working with either buyer or seller. I think they just added it again because it's like, wow, when you get to page 16, maybe you kind of forgot what you put on page 1. So you can check the box again. I don't know. Maybe it will automatically check. If you check it on page 1, maybe it'll auto check here. I don't know. But there's also a box to check if there's more than one agent under the same broker. And so for that, you would use the AAA or additional agent acknowledgement, and you can just check that box. And it's really helpful to add it in and incorporate it. So now this next section is for the designated electronic delivery addresses. This is very important. This is what I was talking about, is going to be something that is overlooked, that may cause issues that you need to pay very close attention to. Okay, once an item is delivered to this address, it is deemed to be delivered and starts the clock. So this is important because the designated electronic delivery address, whatever email or text phone number you put in here, if you get sent a notice to perform, or if you need to send a contingency removal by a certain deadline and you send it somewhere other than what is written in this section, it won't be deemed delivered or received, right? Or let me break those up in 2 different scenarios. If you receive a notice to perform as a listing agent, you want to send a notice to perform and you don't send it to the email or to the text that's in this section, then it's not received, doesn't count. If you send it to the, whatever contact information is listed on the MLS or whatever email you've been corresponding with, it must be whatever is listed here. Likewise, if you have a contingency removal and you need to send it in and deliver it, there is this alternate section, right, that allows for a partner or maybe a more dedicated contact or an admin. Please, dear God, don't put TC emails in here. None of us want this responsibility. But if you have a partner or maybe this section, so like I said, sometimes the MLS pre-fills this. Maybe on the MLS, you're a big team and you have generic information of offers at altarealtygroup.com or whatever, right? And so that's what it will pre-fill. But you want to have okay, this alternate email is going to be, actually Lauren@altarealtygroup.com, or this is who you need to send this information to. So this section is really important for both parties to note and to adhere by, because delivery can now be electronic. And if you get delivered a notice to perform to this email and it's not an email that you check all the time, too bad, so sad. And the clock starts counting. The car attorney was just kind of laughing because we were like, well, what if you don't get the email or something, or, you know, and he's like, it's so funny that when an agent is waiting for their offer to get accepted, they get every email. They get notified all the time.
All of a sudden, right?
Yeah. And then when you get a notice to perform, they don't see it. They didn't get it. There must have been a glitch.
Oh, yeah.
So nobody's buying that. The other thing to note is that there's also a box right there under alternate that, if checked, it means that delivery should only be made to this alternate email address. So if this box is checked and you send a notice to perform to the email on the email line, doesn't count, because you didn't send it to this alternate email. That's where all the items should be delivered. So you can see that this is a big deal. And it's something that is going to be really tricky to navigate. I think it's just going to be a matter of everybody's going to find every email they can possibly find, add it all onto, like, everybody's just going to get CC'd. Like, it's just going to be any email we can find, you're getting included on all of our email chains, because we do not want to run the risk of it not counting as being delivered, or it being delivered and us not seeing it.
Yeah, plus check spam.
Right? Yeah.
Check the spam
Exactly.
folder when you're doing transactions and so forth. I honestly, I have to do it daily. I have to check my spam folder daily. So
Oh,
make
yeah.
it a habit, guys.
Exactly. And, you know, again, it can get complicated when you're dealing with teams, when you're dealing with, you know, like, sometimes you have somebody that negotiates the offer, and then once you get into escrow, it's a different person. And so maybe you need to include that information. You can't just put it in an email. This needs to be what's on the contract. And there's a spot in the seller section where the seller can write in that information as well. So you also want to double check that, because, like I said, MLS will pull that default information. And so if what's on MLS is not correct, you need to make sure that that gets corrected. Okay, I know that was a lot of information crammed into an hour and a half, but we really only scratched the surface of this new contract. So I encourage all of you, again, sign up, take the course offered by CAR. I know 4 hours is a long time, but really it's super important. And like we mentioned in the beginning, we'll be doing additional webinars where we kind of deep dive into the more finer details, talk about logistics, strategies, approaches for different elements in the contract. So, like, how to handle deposits, what to know about all cash offers, how to write up escalation clauses about the appraisal. How are those different now in the contract? What's the cancellation process for this new purchase agreement? How do you navigate those different elements? And these are really kind of in the bulk of all of those pages that we sort of skipped over today. So that's kind of it for me. That's all my contact information. And if anybody has any questions, I'm still here.
Yay. Well, very good, Lauren. I know that was a lot of info. And just remember, everybody, you know, I do put these webinar replays out every time. And you can always go to our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and do a search for Alta Realty Group, and you can get to all of our trainings. And so these trainings, these, you know, new RPA form trainings will live there. And so don't be afraid to go in there and, you know, and that's the great thing about the replays is you can fast forward through stuff, say, okay, yeah, I got that. And you can, you know, fast forward to where you need to, you know, do some extra training. So huge resource for you guys. Don't hesitate to use it, right?
Exactly.
And Charles Barnes says, great presentation, perfect cadence, great stories, humor, excellent detail, very useful. Thanks, Lauren.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely. And Cheryl Peterson, same thing. Wow, Lauren did a phenomenal job. Thank you. Absolutely. Fauzi, thanks. Everybody's excited.
Oh, good.
Totally.
Perfect.
Thank you,
I
Anna.
want to just leave it this, Kev.
Yeah.
Once again, if you don't have somebody in your corner that knows this stuff backwards and forwards, once again, Lauren's showing her professionalism, her attention to detail, and how much time she has spent invested in this new contract and in knowing the ins and outs of the industry changes and all the stuff that's coming our way. So once again, I'm going to keep plugging you, Lauren, because we believe in what you do and how important it is to our industry and to our company and to all of our agents. So get to know Lauren, reach out to her, introduce yourself, and she would love to help you on your next transaction.
Definitely. Thanks so much, guys.
All right. Thanks, Lauren. So agents, have a great week. Get out there, make it a productive week. And we will see you guys next week on the webinar, where we'll get more involved with this great topic. All right, guys, have a great week. Bye-bye.